Yes, hello, good morning. Welcome to those on the video. It is our last week on this Palm Sunday, the sixth and final Sunday of Lent. And it is our last week looking at this book, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. So before we kind of hit, it's a very short section that we have today, kind of closing thoughts by the author, the ethicist, Philip Howden. The last chapter is called How Goodness Happened Here. Gets into a little bit of a philosophical conversation. But before we do that, just even if you haven't had a chance to finish the whole book yet, what are your thoughts now that you've kind of gone through the whole thing or close to it?
Well, I thought there was a very interesting discussion of ethics in this section, between, what was it, Aristotle and Kant and different ones about what is ethics and how each individual, I guess, interprets it different.
Yeah, and then how do you translate that into a Christian lens too? Yeah, different approaches, and I think all those approaches have been lifted up by different parts of the church at some point in time too.
Yeah.
Definitely. It gets a little heady sometimes, but he brings it back down to earth. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's brief enough that it's.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
The person who owned this book before me must have been interested in that discussion because boy, has he underlined a lot of.
Oh, really?
That's how brave the people were who stood up, and took in the Jewish people, and I mean, they were risking their own life every day.
Very much so. And then they even saw what could happen.
Yeah.
Right in front of them to some of their neighbors. Yeah.
Well, and if you read anything about the concentration camps, you know that if they ended up there, that would have, for many of them, that was the death sentence,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And I don't know, I know that they bring it up in here, but I don't know when that really became more public. That what
That
was
they
actually
do the
happening.
concentration,
Yeah, I don't think it really got out there. until
It was
after.
late in the war, it really was.
And even then, they could be like, well, that's just a rumor.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that was brought that up last week, is that I don't know how the Germans were able to keep that such a secret for
Right.
so long. I mean, it was a huge operation.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, they just took a couple hundred people. I mean, they had
Millions.
literally hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, I think
Well,
6 million
I think part
by
of
the end of it.
how they, 6 million Jews.
Yeah,
12
plus
million
others.
people, yes. I think that part of it was suppressing the press.
Yeah.
And,
Oh,
there was
Keeping
a
everybody
story
Yeah,
about a child, well, in those days, this would have been like an almost adult, but like a 13, 14-year-old man who was executed for having a radio.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want people to have information.
Yeah.
They didn't want people to know, and so I think it was more like an open secret. I think people knew without evidence.
Sure.
And didn't talk about it because, the fear that was instilled in them by public displays of people being marched through streets,
Yeah.
and abused and all that. But it just, fear is probably the
yeah,
single greatest demotivator or motivator
Sure.
of, self-protection.
there was,
Well, we lived over there 20 years later,
Yeah.
and they still, like, the concentration camp, they were there, but they were never advertised, how the tourist places, everything
Sure.
else. They were not talked about, and, there were no signs of World War II over there. There were signs, when you went to France, there were signs of World War II everywhere, cemeteries and, the bridge at, from Vermont, something, the big bridge that they went over, anyway. But
Oh, yeah.
there was nothing in Germany.
No.
They just,
No.
well, Arnie
It had
doesn't
to
talk,
be-
Arnie doesn't talk about it.
It had to have been, to the rank and file German, it had to be an embarrassment.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they claim they did not know. Both Erna and she's got a good friend Trudy that I've gotten to know. Of course, they would have been, kids at the time.
Sure.
But, They swear that the average person did not know what was going on.
Which is
And maybe they did not.
Because like Anita said, there was a lot of control over information and how, what got out and how. If you think about the Gestapo, I mean, one of the things that was the most effective was getting folks to inform on one another.
Yeah.
So you just stayed, you kept your head down. And I think last week, didn't we say something about, well, they were just doing what they were told sometimes and that too, it's just like, well, I don't wanna know more, I'll just do my part and I'll be the cog in this part of the machine and I don't need to know anything beyond that.
Well, and that's where, I mean, they started back in the late thirties with
Right,
and they had the German youth and, they just drilled it into those kids that.
And they forced kids to go into the German.
yeah,
Well,
Yeah,
when
the Nazi
at
way.
that age,
Yeah.
they were, and I mean,
We
you
didn't
heard
have to
stories.
watch lectures for like going into Boy Scouts.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I think that. it was-
Well, I mean, you heard
Yeah.
stories, the same thing happened to a degree in Russia, where they would take children and, for one reason or another, put them into, whether it was gymnastics or a good thing, or
Yeah.
the military or whatever, and, they just indoctrinate them into that, and that's all they knew.
well, if you think, a few weeks back for our Wednesday series, we had Encircle Here, and one of the programs they talked about was finding, giving a safe transitional foster care for unaccompanied minors who showed up at the border until they could connect them with families, and they wanted to make sure that the people they were going to were actually their families and not something nefarious. But a lot of those kids, why they're even showing up is, there's countries like El Salvador that have had decades of war and gangs and violence, and one of the things they do is they'll kidnap kids when they're 10, 11, 12 and indoctrinate them into the gangs and say, well, you get them while they're young, you condition them.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they're trying to get out before they get caught. So
Well, I mean,
this is a tried and true method, right?
This has happened in the Sudan, I believe, as well.
what happens in this, it happens in this country,
Happened in this
the
country.
gangs and,
Oh,
Sure.
yeah, you live on those mean streets, you either join a gang or you whatever, yeah.
Yeah. So, that was a nice way to get back into the mood of the book and of Le Chambon. There was one thing that we didn't get to last week that I want to start with on page 266. This is at the very end of the consequences chapter, and he's kind of reflecting on Andre Chocme and who he was as a person here. So the second to last paragraph that starts but even if, I want to go about halfway down. He believed, Chocme believed that decent people who stay inactive out of cowardice, I'm sorry, page 266.
I thought you said 50, that was my
Okay.
fault.
He believed that decent people who stay inactive out of cowardice or indifference when around them human beings are being humiliated and destroyed are the most dangerous people in the world. His nonviolence was not passive or saccharine, but an almost brutal force for awakening human beings. He was not a subtle or gentle man. He earned the description that the national leadership of his church had made of him, that dangerous, difficult Chocme. In the last pages of his autobiographical notes, Chocme wrote, "A curse on him who begins in gentleness. He shall finish in insipidity and cowardice, and shall never set foot in the great liberating current of Christianity." Kindness, in order to be valuable, had to be achieved through a struggle with the forces for humiliation and death that are part of mankind. So that
That's really heavy.
it is heavy. And you think of the crucible he lived in, not even, even before the war, he lived through World War I, his mother dying, the realization he had of how the poorer classes looked at his rich family, he came up in this crucible, and combined with his personality, combined with his convictions, he was very much black and white, right? There was no middle ground. You either were in all the way or you were hurting the cause. He could still find ways to have grace for people, but he was not a kind and gentle person. It makes me wonder what he would, he said that, it said earlier that the Sermon on the Mount was very important in his preaching. Well, what would he have done with the Beatitudes? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That doesn't seem to be his approach here. So, I mean,
Oh, you don't know his definition of meek.
that is true.
Like, exactly.
So maybe meek means, meek in the eyes of the world. If you're practicing nonviolence, people think you're meek and weak.
Mhm.
But I mean, what does this say to you for back then? What does this say to you today? For this approach. If the decent people who stay inactive out of cowardice or indifference, when around them human beings are being humiliated and destroyed, are the most dangerous people in the world. What do you think of that? That's a pretty provocative statement.
I think it's pretty accurate, probably is. Because
Did Martin Luther King have a line along those lines too about, wish I could quote things better. It was something along the lines of, it's not the white supremacists or something along those lines that are the biggest issue. It's the folks that are just like, oh well, or just sit quietly in their church pews and don't ever do anything. I can't remember the exact quote,
I
but
know what
something
you're
along those
talking
similar
about.
lines.
I do, I'm glad you recalled that. He said so many things, I can't remember them.
I know people tend to just quote, I have a dream, but he has a lot more than just that.
Oh, definitely.
Anyway, sorry.
Hate cannot eradicate love, only, or love cannot, whatever. Hate cannot eradicate hate, only love can do that.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorites of this. Light cannot, dark cannot stand up there. Anyway, that's, I guess, that's the
Yeah.
thing, is that, you have to know what you stand for and you have to stand for it. And that doesn't mean you have to be a bully or mean, but when you see injustice, you have to address it. And it takes courage.
Yeah.
And it takes as Doug said about them putting their lives on the line.
Yeah.
The courage to stand for your principle. But if we believe what we say we believe as Christians, that is far more valuable than staying on earth, what I mean, and watching destruction around us, right?
I mean, we're getting the Passion story today, because it's not just Palm Sunday, it's also Passion Sunday, Sunday of the Passion. So we will get the whole story of Jesus, being told to stop, being threatened, being brought before the authorities. He could have copped out, but he sticks with it. He says, let this cup pass through me, but not my will, your will. And he goes all the way to the cross. He gets beaten and humiliated and crucified, mock trial. He goes there to stand up for him. I mean, John the Baptist gets beheaded. Disciples get martyred. I mean, that's part of the Christian story is if you are preaching the message of the gospel that Jesus is the Lord to the other lords of the world, sometimes they push back.
Yeah, on a practical level, I've been fighting a lot of it internally with the Israeli government and the way they treat the Palestinians. I've been there a couple times and they're just ordinary people. They've got schools for their kids and they're good students. They're probably better students than our kids are. And everything is just being torn apart now. I mean, they're wiping Gaza clean. Well, where are those people? What are left of them? Every weekend, there are more homes bombed and the death rates for the children. But, so I can write letters to Tim Kaine and Mark Warren that they don't answer. Once one of them answered, but what do I do? And I can see very quickly that, that the money that I donate, no one's gonna come after me at my age, but I can see why people who are younger, they were involved in these organizations would be afraid even in the United States.
Oh, yeah. I was listening to NPR on the way in here and they were talking to people at Brown University.
Yeah.
People here on visas are being pursued.
Their
For
visas
their
are getting
activism
canceled,
and-
and at least a few have already been
Even if you see them.
arrested and
deported.
or sent to a detention center in Louisiana or Texas.
Yeah.
Because they protested against,
Gaza.
uh,
I think that, well, there's two extremely egregious ones. That young man who's married to an American citizen who is 8 or 9 months pregnant now. He was taken from up north and sent to Louisiana.
Yep.
And his name's Khalil something,
Yeah.
and all for peaceful protest at Columbia, I believe, right?
Maybe, there's another
I mean,
one,
there's so many.
Georgetown.
universities now that are involved, but he didn't firebomb anyone, he did, it's just protesting, just, absolutely protesting. And Judy, I've told you guys before, I have a really good friend who, has sons in the Israeli army. And we don't talk about this anymore because, I told her, it's like, and I think she cringes at it too, but like I said, we can talk about it.
Organizations, they're not all.
Oh, I know,
Yeah.
but what's happening over there has gone beyond seeking Hamas, trying to get the hostages back. Well, in fact, that's her thing, is they need to release the
Well, there's
hostages.
no gonna be
But-
peace until they
No,
solve that problem.
but meanwhile, Netanyahu is committing genocide and, killing innocent people, starving them, destroying their homes.
Yeah, I know that's a loaded word, but I don't know how else to describe it.
Oh, when you start talking numbers,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's just, and especially the starvation.
Yeah.
That's.
You gotta, it's the end game, you wonder what, it's gotta be the elimination of those folks.
Right.
Oh, you might
yeah,
dress
no,
it up some
no.
other way, like saying, oh, well, no, we're gonna just build a community for them in Poland, right?
Right, yeah.
In some other country, yes.
Okay,
But at the same time, if you are from another country and you're here in this country as a student and everything's being paid and you start protesting against who's paying your tuition over here, I can understand.
I don't know.
no, because if this is a whole, this is getting off topic, but if this is a country of First Amendment rights,
Mhm.
and if they're here legally, then they should be able to enjoy the same rights as the other
Peaceful
ones.
protests. I mean,
Like you
that's-
said, they didn't bomb
Well,
anything, they didn't.
I don't necessarily think it's off topic, it's sort of an aside to it, but I mean, it's the same thing that these people were facing.
Yeah,
There was persecution of this group and
Yeah.
this was an example of one group that stood up against it, or at least didn't facilitate it.
There's been talk of not just sending illegal immigrants to the
Right.
mega prison in El Salvador, but there's been open public comments to say, man, we could deport citizens over there too.
without due process.
And that's really scary to me, and that does
It's really scary.
sound like this, because if you can do it, I feel like these are the test runs, right?
I agree with you.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
If we can get away with this, then how much further can we
And
push?
just do
That's
it
fair.
incrementally. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being overly paranoid, but it sounds familiar.
Mhm.
So, I don't know. But okay, back to what you're saying, Don, even if we would say, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you, so to speak. There should still be due process, right? You shouldn't just be like grabbed off the street.
There are so many people waiting to come into this country legally
Sure.
that I think they should have priority over those who are sneaking in.
Oh, but that's two different things. Like the folks that they're taking now did come in legally. They're here on student
Yeah.
visas. They went through all the hoops. They got all the permissions.
But I wouldn't go to somebody's house if I was a guest and then criticize them in their own house.
Well, but then it's like, oh, well, yeah, that's the point.
But if they're criticizing Israel's government, that's not criticizing the people in our house.
Yeah, they are criticizing what we're doing.
Well, I thought the protests were more
The
about,
protests were really about the violence there, not about, I don't remember seeing anything directly about
protests were
support
about
of
what?
Israel. The violence there, the killing of Palestinians.
not that anybody was saying, go Hamas, right? Like,
Yeah.
take those hostages, like.
No, that's, it's on behalf, and the Palestinian people are similar to the regular German people in this, in that they are under a regime that has brutalized Israelis, and they're being held accountable for it,
Yeah.
which is not right. But they have nowhere to go, and
So here's what I would say, since we're in a book of ethics, all I would say is. whatever's going on right now, and there's definitely stuff going on right now in our country and other countries in the world.
Mhm.
Whatever's going on, I would just say, do your due diligence and check things against your conscience and what we've learned as Christians over the years. If something doesn't feel right, then dig into it a little bit, because maybe it turns out to be nothing. Maybe it is, red herrings or all smoke and a fire.
Okay, so, what doesn't feel right is what's happening now. And I can write a few letters and I can send a little bit of money to organizations, it's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
But
Well,
is that all I can do?
I don't know, a couple Saturdays ago, there was a couple million people across the country
That's
out
right.
with signs. Whether
That's
you
right.
agree with that or not, that is something you can do. You can get up and protest, you can write your letters, you can divest your 401ks from the places that you don't want your money to be. Like, there's stuff that has been done, like in South Africa, the divestment thing was really instrumental in ending apartheid.
There are economic protests that are ongoing as well,
Yeah,
don't support this, or, don't shop here, to give them the idea that people have the power.
and yeah, and there's nothing against the law in saying, I don't think we should shop at a certain place.
Right, right.
But I've heard some things about that too,
Yeah,
that should be
I just
criminalized.
can't believe that as a human people, we're supposed to be kind and
Mhm.
generous and loving, that we can behave like this, that we can hide so much.
Yeah.
You know how they hid it during the Second World War, the press certainly hid things, and they do it again today.
There are forces of evil in the world.
I guess I'm.
I have a good friend who was very, she and I are very in sync on all of these things, so that's why I said, I'm kind of disappointed that my naivete. I really am, because I've always been such a true believer
Well,
of.
if you think back to a few years ago in Charlottesville, there was the neo-Nazis that marched with tiki torture. A lot of folks were saying out in public, this just isn't the America I know or recognize. And a lot of other folks, especially the ones like that those people marching were yelling about, like Jews and African Americans, they were saying, well, this is the America I've known for a long time, right? That's like, so maybe it was under the surface or behind the doors, maybe it
Right.
wasn't, but they're like, yeah, this is actually what we live with all the time. This is more upfront, out in the open.
I read a really interesting article about the proliferation of information via social media and the internet,
Mhm.
and how that has just completely changed everything. And I mean, and you can see this, I mean, I think everybody probably is aware of this on some level, but the influences are, you could find probably 100 people, posting things online that support any point of view, and
But they're driven to make a profit, they're driven to
Right.
get you to the more extreme and the more extreme. Because the
exactly,
more angry or upset you are, the more you're gonna click and
that's
follow.
right, exactly.
So if they've monetized
It's just mass
anger and paranoia.
manipulation,
Yeah, it is.
and I don't know what the answer to that is, I have some smart.
I think
person
the
somewhere
thing that's been going on in Israel and over there, it's been at least since World War II. When
Oh,
so
sure.
many of
Oh,
the,
yeah,
the Jewish Europeans,
Yeah, it's like, hey, we're gonna put these people here.
right, and the people who lived there said, maybe we don't want all of you, you know?
Right.
exactly,
Yeah.
and that was imperialism, they decided, sure, go ahead and give this to the Jewish people because they need a place. But because there's poor Palestinians there who can't fight back.
That is honestly the thing, maybe the thing in the Bible that still troubles me the most. Is, okay, we're gonna go back to the Holy Land, see all these Canaanites here, wipe them out, don't marry them, like. This is coming from God, like, aren't they also created in your
Yeah.
image, like that, I've always struggled with that.
When I first went to Palestine the first time, we were at, a dinner one night, I guess, and there was a clergy person who was just a young man. And I asked him how long his family has been in this country. I'd just gotten there, so I didn't know anything about anything. And how long his family had been there, and he said, oh, since Pentecost. I mean, that's how strongly they feel, and that's true about that land, they own a portion of that land.
And land is very important in the Old Testament.
Yeah, oh, yes.
It's not just, oh, this is where you live, it's like this. It's
Yeah.
tied up in the covenants and the promises. All right, well, this is, let's get into the book a little bit more and see if that. What that has an impact on our conversation about current events, because there is some stuff going on that's troubling. Page 272.
Hey, what?
272. This is getting into a little bit of what Jeffrey said about the kind of overview of ethics. So it says, in fact, the more carefully one looks at particular areas of the law and particular areas in ethics, the more similarities one finds. For instance, both criminal law and life and death ethics seek to curb the destructive power of mankind. Both seek to restrain harm doing. At least both claim to be seeking this. In any case, where there is totally unrestrained destructive force, there is neither criminal law nor a life and death ethic. The law of the jungle is neither criminal law nor ethical law. Where might is right, there is no ethical or legal right. In the process of restraining destructive power, both rely heavily upon facts. The law has rules of evidence, and in its own unorganized way, so does ethics. Anyone hearing Darcysac's or Chalkmay's ethical judgments upon the people of Les Chambon would, as a matter of course, demand reliable testimony, facts, before assenting to those judgments. That's why he wrote the book. Why would we call these people good? Well, here, let me make the case. And so, wherever possible, he sought firsthand testimony. So, what are the characteristics of actual life and death ethics? That it restrains harm doing, and that it relies on facts and the truth. It can't just be some pie in the sky ideal. It has to be grounded in something. Boy, do we see that in the people of Les Chambon and Chalkmay and his wife Magda, where maybe Chalkmay had the vertical ethics with God, but that horizontal face-to-face ethics that Magda lived, that's what we're talking about. So don't do harm and have it be concrete based on truth. Clearly, these people are suffering. They've flooded their homes. We're gonna help. Keeping going here at the bottom there. The law has fundamental principles, beliefs it assumes without proof and frequently without comment. In American criminal law, it is presumed that an accused person is innocent until proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, right? The presumption at the foundation of life and death ethics is that all human life is precious. We've heard that refrain. The Chambonnais showed their allegiance to this presumption by disturbing the center of their domestic lives and endangering their own existence to protect the lives of human beings, and in the process, they never sought to do grievous harm to anyone. That's the big unique thing with Les Chambon. Not only did they protect folks, but they also maintained nonviolence. The Nazis had other presumptions about the preciousness of human life. The official handbook, here we go, of the Hitler Youth Organization states those presumptions succinctly when it says, the foundation of the National Socialist outlook on life is the perception of the unlikeness of men. Then it goes on about developing the meaning of this assertion by pointing out that only those of German blood are precious, while the Jews are not. Indeed, it becomes clear in the course of reading the handbook, and any other major document of Nazism, that Jews are ultra enemies of those of German blood. Military enemies have some value because they have valor, but they are so different are Jews from those of German blood that they must be treated like disease germs or vermin and not simply conquered. The distance between this belief and the tenet that all human beings are precious is the ethical distance between the Nazis and the nonviolent Chambonnais. So there's a little ethical framework here. Let's turn a couple more pages to 277.
The Germans were still invading and killing. It talks about them coming into the villages and you didn't know the war was over. I mean, I keep wondering why they would continue to kill if they knew the war was over.
I'm sure it took quite a while for the message to spread, yeah. I mean, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have texting, they didn't have.
They have word of mouth, and that was being.
And then some radio, if you had to have a radio that do that, but yeah, There's no different than this, you know,
So you just keep doing the job you were told to do.
Well, some pockets surrendered and some probably didn't know, and I think there were also some who said, well, then we better do as much as we can before they,
Yeah, right.
while they
right,
can.
Right.
277, top of the page. It's about the preciousness of life. Such a realization, such an imaginative perception of the connection between the preciousness of life, of my life, and the preciousness of other lives, is the vital center of life and death ethics. It's not just about me. If we do not discern that connection, other people's lives are as precious as ours, and therefore if someone else is suffering, so are we. Then the laws of ethics are empty patterns of sounds and shapes without meaning or force. The moral leadership of Andre Trocme consisted in keeping this perception green in his own life and in the lives of others. And then the next few pages are what Jeffrey was referring to, where we get into Aristotle and Immanuel Kant. Aristotle, that you find out whether a person is good. It's about their character, right? It's all about somebody's happiness, right? Kant was about the inward was more important than the outward. Andre Trocme would be the opposite. Your outward actions showed what your inward thing was. And that kind of, for me, tracks with the gospel, especially the last few years. I've picked up on and noticed this theme in the gospels more than I ever have before. Bearing good fruit, bearing good fruit, bearing good fruit. So and James does this, right? It's like the difference between Paul and James. Paul is a lot about the internal, right? What I do not do what I want, instead I do the things I don't want. I'm talking about sin and this internal struggle of flesh versus spirit. And James was like, faith without works is dead. Whatever's going on internally is all well and good, but if it doesn't then translate into how you treat your neighbors, and James is big on the poor, and if there's somebody who doesn't have a coat, give them a coat, very practical things, then it's not working. So it's really been hitting me the last few years how much Jesus especially talks about bearing good fruit. So Immanuel Kant, there's something to what he says, right? That what's going on inside is really, important in terms of how ethical you are. What do you hold dear? What are your core values? All of that stuff. But Trocme says that's all well and good, but unless it actually is lived out, especially when those around you are in need, then that doesn't mean anything. Page 280. Just kind of running through these so we have some time to talk. Page 280, ethics is contextual, not abstract only. So we get a lot of, he said this before, but he mentions, like, for instance, Tale of Two Cities. Okay, you have to understand that there was a revolution going on. You have to understand how the poor were being treated both in England and in France. And you have to understand how they had nothing left to lose, so they could rise up against the upper class and the king in France, right? So you wouldn't understand Tale of Two Cities unless Dickens spent so much ink, as Dickens does, explaining to you what the situation of the context was. So we have this whole book explaining the context of both Le Chambon and Trocme, and understanding where they're coming from, because otherwise any of their ethical stuff won't make sense outside of that context. And then he talks about on page 281, about halfway down, talking about kind of rules of what you do here. Halfway through that paragraph that starts, there are such rules. He says they fall into two categories: negative commandments and positive ones. In an ethic of life and death, there is an ethic of refusal and there is an ethic of positive action. So what are the things you won't do, your non-negotiables, and then what are you going to do about it in the world to respond? That's what we have to. Good one.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of some of the things you could be asked to do that, and the ethical ones. The positive ethics.
Page 283. Starting with the first full paragraph. It is this positive aspect of ethics, what you do, that the cities of refuge in Deuteronomy exhibit. Talked about that a couple weeks ago. When Moses tells Israel in Deuteronomy 19 to set apart such places of refuge, he makes it plain that if the Jews do not prevent innocent blood from being shed in these places, the guilt of bloodshed be upon you. For citizens of such places, it is not enough to be harmless. It is necessary also for them to keep others from doing harm to those who come within the gates. Does any of this have an impact on our current events conversation? Edouard Tice has taken great pains to show me that he and Trocmé were trying to prevent the Nazi and Vichy from violating the commandment against killing. They were trying to protect the victims, but they were also trying to stop human beings who were hell-bent on becoming victimizers, hell-bent on doing evil. That's why he went and still preached to the prisoners at the end of the war in the little castle thing on the river. He went and preached to the Germans, even though people in Les Chambon were like, how dare you? How dare you go preach the gospel to them? He wanted them to be saved too. They were trying to protect the victim. I just read that. Trocmé and Tice believed that if they failed to protect those in Les Chambon, they, the ministers, would share the guilt of the evil ones who actually perpetrated the harm to them. It's the cities of refuge concept. Self-control and health are the two main aspects of a life and death ethic. Refusing to use our own power to destroy our fellow human beings and actively preventing others from using that power were the main ethical guidelines of the Chevalier. Now, they wouldn't have said that, but this guy, as an ethicist, is able to describe it in these terms. Couple more, page 284. I'm about halfway down. If we would understand the goodness that happened in Les Chambon, we must see how easy it was for them to refuse to give up their consciences, to refuse to participate in hatred, betrayal, and murder, and to help the desperate adults and the terrified children who knocked on their doors in Les Chambon. We must see this, and we must also see the many elements that came together to make these things happen. And this sentence really got me. Goodness is the simplest thing in the world and the most complex, like opening a door. Because he says, when you think of opening a door, you could look at it like an engineer, right? You have the hinges, and it has to be balanced, and it has to have the right kind of pull, and it has to have lubrication, right? And the hinges get the WD-40. It has to clasp and lock in such a way so that all has to line up. There has to be ventilation at the bottom so it doesn't seal, so the air gets in, right? When you think of a door as an engineer, as a carpenter, as a builder, there's a lot that goes into it. But you can also think of opening a door as like Kramer on Seinfeld, and you just slide on it. Or you just open the door, you don't think about it. So it's, goodness is as simple as opening a door. And it's also as complex as opening a door when you get down to it. Because it might depend on what's on the other side of the door. Last quote I want to do. There's some nice stories in the postscript with Magda when she's older coming to visit the author in his home and interacting with his son. Those are
I thought that, yeah, whether she was interacting with his son,
yeah, those are
that
nice.
was pretty cool.
She needs a little more praise, doesn't she?
I think he praises her a bit, but yeah. Trocmé may have been the driving force, but I think she was one of his driving force. But the last one I want to lift up here is page 284. Let's see. The one that starts, we fail to understand. 2/3 down. We fail to understand. It's 284. Okay. We fail to understand what happened in Les Chambon if we think that for them their actions were complex and difficult. John Stuart Mill, in his essay Utilitarianism, wrote that a benevolent person is someone who comes, as though instinctively, to be conscious of himself as a being who, of course, pays regard to others. The good of others becomes to him a thing naturally and necessarily to be attended to, like any of the physical conditions of our existence. All right, Donna, you just got an award. Judy, you're over at MSEP all the time. I mean, when you go to MSEP, are you doing it to get a gold star and award? Or are you doing it because there's people there who need help? Right?
I told somebody I'd do it because I'd get out of housework.
Well, there you go. I think there might be more to it than that. You wouldn't have been doing this for 48 years if you had that much else.
In fact, one of the volunteers and award last week. Yeah, it's great.
You're even in the bulletin.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah.
That Facebook page.
On Facebook? Oh, gee, I'm not sure that's good.
We'll get it over.
Well, it must be true if it's on Facebook.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
I don't even like Facebook, so.
Well, MSEP posted it. I trust.
Oh, okay.
Did Donna repost it to our Facebook page?
I think so, yes.
Um,
I mean, I don't know who reposted it, but I'm pretty sure that's where I saw
But
it.
this tracks with something I preach all the time, that serving other people is not Santa Claus naughty and nice list, right? You're not, when you're loving your neighbor. Hey, sorry, it's not when you're loving your neighbor, it's not in order to earn points with God. You're not doing it because you have to, it's a get to, it's a response to the grace that you've received. You love others because you have been loved. You forgive others because you've been forgiven. You serve others because God, Jesus serves you. Right? So if you do that often enough, then after a while, it just becomes natural. Right?
But people have different personalities.
Oh, sure.
Like, I used to go to sort clothes every Friday, and now we have tons of people who wanna go sort clothes,
Mhm.
but they will not volunteer to go and help somebody find clothes. They,
Yeah.
I don't know whether they're timid about interacting with other people,
Could be.
which,
Well, I should come to, I'd love.
yeah, I was gonna say, maybe it's the school teacher part. Yeah, but some of us really, I really enjoy helping somebody, find that perfect piece of clothing or clothes for their new baby coming, or men are hysterical because there's the ones that just went and grab it off the shelf, they don't care what it looks like, and then there are those who are really picky. So-
Yeah, it's, that's real life.
And I think, that's why I'm thankful that there were 12 disciples and they were all different. I'm thankful for Paul teaching about the body of Christ, that all these different members with all these different gifts all together do this. And so you can't just take what works for you and rubber stamp it on everybody else. Why aren't you doing it like I do it?
It'd be a pretty boring world if we were all exactly like.
I mean, chocolate and teas were,
Work without all its parts.
right, chocolate and teas were very different. The villagers were different, Chocolate came at it at this level and he was thinking all the time, all this. And they were doing it for their reasons, but it worked together. All the other folks that we get profiles of all had different personalities. Even the Forestier guy from last week, who was just out there and like flamboyant, like, hey, everybody, and like shut him up. And like, but that's just who he was. And
But I think how brave these people who took in others,
yeah,
because
And they didn't
if
have the
they had
food
been
either.
caught doing this, it could have been execution for them, or prison at least.
Corey ten Boom's Auschwitz for hiding people, you know what I mean, and like,
and these folks were already starving and hurting and
Exactly.
poor, and they're taking these others in.
Yeah.
It's
Or
crazy.
the story about the girl in Holland, the hiding place, is that what it was called?
yeah, that's Corey ten Boom.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that was a really good book.
Yeah.
But they, they were betrayed by someone.
Yes.
They had like a sign they would put up and they knocked it down. And the Nazis figured that out, and so they put it back together even though it was broken, and people came in their shop and, thinking it was safe.
Yeah, because she eventually, when she was arrested, and she died in prison.
No, her sister Betsy died in prison. She
It's a long time
survived.
ago, I read that book.
Yeah, I read that book several times. I think that was one of the books that really drew me into the whole, whatever.
So it is times like this where the evil rises the biggest that end up producing stories like these, where the amount of good to overcome it, like you were quoting, the amount of love to overcome the hate has to be even bigger than the hate. And it is part of the human nature and human condition that will kind of, out of fear, out of comfort, out of inertia, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want the scrutiny to come on us. And a lot of times those decent people who do nothing, they don't mean bad, but they're the ones who help get it to the point where it's so bad that then it has to, have the corresponding. Maybe if we had medium amounts of good all along, we would have to get to but that's just not, there's a cycle to this, right? Last one, picking up where we left off, bottom of 284. I have walked out of the temple after, this is the author talking, I have walked out of the temple after services with a crowd of peasants and villagers around me, and I have seen them one after another put astonishingly large amounts of money into the donation box to our left. Their clothes hung on their work-hardened bodies, and with the same clumsy ease that they exhibited in walking with those wooden shoes, they put their precious money into a box not for their own church, but for flood or earthquake victims on the other side of the planet somewhere. Remember, this is like 30 years later. Once I asked Teeks, who was leaving with me, who these victims were. He had just put a very large bill into the box. He looked at me in surprise and said, "Oh, I don't know. They're people." Okay. This wordless simplicity was important to the moving spirit of Le Chambon. In an unpublished essay by May in 1934 called The Opposite of Evil, he expressed his belief that in times of crisis, theories and predictions are a refuge for cowards. In that essay, he wrote of the dangers involved in trying to predict the effects of your actions on your own life, your family's lives, the lives of your parish, the lives of your countrymen. During the war years, he did not spend precious time and energy investigating the effects of his actions on any political theory he might hold. He chose to do without intellectual systems and without fear-filled predictions. He decided simply to help the unjustly persecuted innocents around him. He decided to obey God's imperious commandments against killing and betraying. With his sophisticated mind, he put his sophisticated mind aside and chose to be a kindler, the German soldier he met in World War I, who would not kill and would not betray. Thoughts?
Just, I'm glad we didn't, I don't live in that time.
Yeah,
It must have been really scary and awful.
yeah.
There's just something about the way they gave so generously and they seem so kind and I mean.
Well, let me push it into the uncomfortable. Let's say there's somebody from VCU who's here on a student visa, and they just found out that without their knowledge, their student visa had been canceled. They can't go back home for whatever reason. Let's say there's a war or something. Would you hide them in your house?
No, I'll be honest, no.
Yeah.
I would.
Would you find somebody else who could? Would you hook them up with stuff from inside? Like what? And you don't need to answer anything, but like, right, maybe this is parallel, maybe it isn't. Maybe you see it as the same thing, maybe you don't. But if somebody came to you who is asking for help, who's desperate, what would you do? I don't know what I'd do. You know, got 3 kids in my house. Do I put them in danger?
I would do what I could,
Chalk may have 4.
you know, whatever that would be, you know what I mean, like you
Yeah.
said, it might not be.
Yeah.
The hiding, it might
Right.
be, you know, helping them find a place to hide,
And this is not Le Chambon. Remember, context is important.
yeah.
But what about your context in your life? What would happen? And so that's kind of where I want to leave you. I mean, the whole thing of this book, even if it's not saying it out loud, is what would you do? That's kind of part of the study of ethics. What would you do?
I think that's why instead, we don't ask, we don't make it show proof of the United States citizenship or even being here legally. I think we just don't, we don't want to know. Just
Yeah.
don't, you know, if you don't know, you,
Sure.
right, I guess you don't feel guilty if you don't know.
Right, and then you can't get in trouble if you didn't ask.
So you didn't know.
Yeah.
You want to know what country this person's from before I say yes or no?
Let's say Afghanistan.
But
Let's say Afghanistan, they just have their status revoked as being here as an emergency group. And so all those folks that helped in the war and translators and informants who came over here to escape the Taliban, they just got their protected status revoked. So let's say
Did that actually happen?
let's say it's Afghanistan.
Why? What is the justification?
If
Sorry,
I don't know. I don't know.
they ate it
yeah,
up on
the
us.
people we work with, the Afghanistan people that we work with.
We have,
Do they have green cards or what?
we don't ask. And we have Hispanic people, we don't ask.
Right. So that's big. That's what I'm gonna leave you with. That's Palm Sunday, which quickly turns to Passion Sunday. So I want to leave you with some holy discomfort.
Can you just?
What would you do?
The bags this week?
Then before we walk out the door,
What day was you?
a couple of housekeeping
Oh,
notes.
it doesn't.
First of all, if this was meaningful to you, these were used books, right? Share it with somebody.
Yes.
I think this is a powerful story and I think it gets a lot of thinking and praying going. So share this with other people if that feels appropriate. And then two things, next Sunday is Easter, we won't have class. We'll come for the breakfast, cheer on the kids for the Easter egg hunt on Easter service. The following Sunday, I will be off, as is my custom, and Pastor Jim Berg said he'd be happy to come in and do a class on archaeology and some other stuff that's a passion of his, so he'll come in and do the class, so don't skip out the Sunday after Easter. I know that's traditionally a big drop off in attendance, pastor's gone, Easter hangover, whatever it is, but come on back for that one. And then, real quick, because I gotta go set up, is there any, ideas or requests for what's left of Easter for a class topic?
So what's left of Easter?
It'll be April, it'll be basically May until Pentecost, so
Oh,
5 or 6 weeks of class. Any requests?
we could start this book over again. Anytime we felt we finished it the second time.
I read this 20 years ago-ish, 18. And reading it again was,
And that's something like some
Well, it's interesting too, that, you know, the context, not only of when this occurred and all of that, in the context of that, but also in the context of realizing that he wrote this book back in the 70s, which in itself was very,
Revolutionary.
this was written in 1979 and then re-released with a new introduction in 94. And even that's
I mean,
like 30 years ago.
but I mean, he was doing the research in the 70s or whatever, when, you know, because I can remember thinking, real quick, I remember taking a physics class and had a quiz and went to the professor, because I didn't understand why he marked my answer down. When he went over it on the board, my answer looked a lot like his. And, you know, the first thing he did was look me up in his grade book, and he said, "Oh, you're one of those pre-vet students. You guys are always in here whining for more points." And, you know, it was very unlike me, but I said, "No. The grade stands. I just want to know what was wrong with my answer."
Oh.
So I
Did he
mean,
tell you?
it was very, well, but I mean, it was very, I mean, I didn't like being stereotyped.
No.
I was in that group. No, I wasn't. That wasn't why I was there. I was there because I didn't understand.
Yeah, it never feels
But I
good
was-
when you're just painted with the light brush.
Yeah, and that's,
But I get that part of Jeffrey, but was he able to
Yeah.
bring you to an understanding of where your solution differed enough for him to mark you down?
After you corrected.
Your email number.
I'm sure he did. I probably then had painted myself in a corner that,
Yeah,
you know, I would be scrutinized even closer in the future, but.
right.
I mean, 70s was very much dead center of the Cold War. People were very interesting. A lot of protests still, economic stuff hitting in different parts of the decade. All the, you know, Vietnam wrapping up, Nixon, all the Watergate stuff.
Yeah.
It was a tumultuous time, just like it is now, but just different ingredients in the pot. You know about that. Making projects too, right? It's
Every pot's the same, every pot's different.
exactly. On that note, God be with us in our current pot. Thanks, everybody.
We will wave some palms.
All right, good.
Are we gonna go out to the